Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking. I'm your host, Sheri Horn Hasan of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on July 28th during a heat wave 2023 from Karmic Evolution Astrology. I said that already. I meant to say from KarmicEvolution.com or any of your favorite podcast stations. Just a quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. First, my usual housekeeping stuff, which is to tell you that you can listen to this podcast anytime just by going to KarmicEvolution.com and scrolling down the page and finding the most recent recording. Or you can search the archived listings for past podcasts which you may have missed or which you'd like to listen again. Again, I also noted that the show can be accessed on all the major podcast stations, so you don't have to go to KarmicEvolution.com, but it is an easy way to access the show. Anyway, the show drops every Friday now between 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern, so you can listen at that time or anytime after. But if you do go to KarmicEvolution.com, you'll see above the most recently posted show, which is you access the show by going to the website and then hitting podcast in the upper right-hand corner of the banner. And while you're on that page, you'll see the most recently posted show, and above it a downloadable freebie labeled How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy, which is friendly advice for every sun sign from renowned astrologer Stephen Forrest, about what each of us, depending on our sun sign, needs to be happy. And this is based on an interview I did with Stephen a couple years ago, and he's given me permission to distribute it more widely as a means of promoting the validity of astrology in our lives. So yes, it will sign you up for my Conversations About Consciousness newsletter, but you can, of course, unsubscribe anytime. All right, I don't know if it's the heat, because I did go walking this morning, but I went early, and I seem to be having some trouble with pronunciation right now, so hopefully it'll get better. Maybe I just haven't done enough talking today. All right, well, I'm going to talk to you guys. In any case, be sure to grab that downloadable freebie when you go to KarmicEvolution.com to listen to this podcast, again, whether you do so when it's live or after the fact, and enjoy some of Stephen Forrest's words of astrological wisdom. Now, separately, you can always follow me on my Facebook page, which is Karmic Evolution for Your Soul, and that's where you can keep track of upcoming podcast content and other astro news you can use. I also post now on Instagram under karmic.evolution, so feel free to follow me there as well. And finally, I'm offering still my discounted 75-minute Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $125, and that offer is for podcast listeners only. So if you're interested in astrology and want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart in order to gain greater consciousness about your soul's true mission and purpose in this lifetime, and you desire to move from chaos to clarity about what might more specifically be holding you back from achieving your most cherished desires in the areas of greatest interest to you, whether that be your relationships, your job and your career, your finances, or maybe your health, then this is the reading for you. A Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading takes a look at how the energies into which you entered this lifetime, or through which you entered this lifetime, may be keeping you stuck in old habitual patterns, or what I call soul-conditioned behavior, and how such knowledge can assist you to make different, more positive choices moving forward. So if you'd like to co-create your own future happiness using astrological insight as your guide, well, that's easy when you take advantage of my special discounted offer, which you can find at karmicevolution.com/karmic125. As I always like to say, conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable. All right, so let's get into this week's Astro news you can use. We may better recognize now how current power struggles represent an evolutionary turning point since Mars in Virgo opposed Saturn in Pisces a week ago, July 20th, and the Sun opposed Pluto July 21st. Fighting to defend and protect our right to live in harmony with the natural cycles of life is part of the currently waxing Cancer New Moon's monthly cycles theme, of which we are still under the auspices, exemplified at that lunation by the Grand Cardinal Cross, formed by the shifted transiting nodal karmic nodes square to Pluto retrograde in Capricorn, and both luminaries' opposition to Pluto retrograde. This signaled that change was afoot, whether we like it or not. Whenever Pluto is involved, it's always a change or be changed proposition. We can, both collectively and personally, go willingly, or we can go kicking and screaming. But either way, archetypally evolution-driven Pluto always advises that we adapt in order to survive rather than risking extinction, aka becoming old, obsolete relics of a no longer relevant past. Now, helping us to carry out this mission of adapting to evolutionary trends, come hell or high water, and whether we like it or not, is Venus's current retrograde and the Sun's position now in Leo, both since July 22nd, along with wounded healer Chiron's retrograde since July 23rd. These are our call to develop the courage to reevaluate how to best speak out about wounding relationships, especially those which disparage Cancer's archetypal great mother's feminine divine energies, and to promote further healing. Because doing so helps us fulfill the mission of the newly shifted Aries North Node, as it beckons us to release old Libra South Node tendencies to negotiate and compromise at the expense of developing emotional independence now. So as Venus stationed retrograde at 28 degrees and 36 minutes of Leo, and it does so, it will be in Leo, it will be retrograde from July 22nd until September 3rd, which is when Venus stations direct again at 12 degrees 14 minutes of Leo. We have the opportunity to think about how we relate to others, and whether we're engaged in partnerships that value our emotional independence as much as we value their emotional independence. Because if not, we're looking at making changes once Venus stations direct between September 3rd and circa October 7th or 8th, when Venus reaches the degree at which she originally stationed retrograde on July 22nd. Which is that 28 degrees and 36 minutes. Now, the ultimate realignment of relationships between now and then may prove especially intense during the period when Venus retrograde reaches her inferior conjunction, or the exact Sun-Venus retrograde conjunction on August 13th, followed by her heliacal rising circa August 19th and 20th. Now, I spoke about this last week, along with quoting Jungian astrologer Erin Sullivan, who wrote in her Retrograde Planets book that we can look back now at Venus retrogrades past to determine the meaning of the current one. And I'm going to requote her because I do think it bears underlining and repetition. So this is what she said, or says, or writes, or wrote in her book. Quote, "The inferior planets always pick up unfinished processes where they left off in the last retrograde cycle. That's because Venus retrograde always transits the same natal house every 8 years, reviewing and resurrecting incomplete and or dormant issues which have been quiescent since the last transit. One gets a cold, hard look at one's relationships and at what is relevant to one's integrity at this time," Sullivan says. Quote, "The station retrograde begins a time of review when the entire Earth experiences the retrograde phenomenon. We can see how it manifests in the collective by watching the news in regard to diplomatic and international relations. The reconsideration of what is diplomatic and what is necessary to maintain a balanced worldview and sense of integrity is precisely what happens to the individual when Venus transits a sector of the natal horoscope. The Maya believed that the point at which Venus reaches her heliacal rising, about 6 or 7 days after the inferior conjunction, was when political situations were unstable and leaders insecure and fallible." Now, I want to just add the caveat that if we take it out of the realm of only the political, which I'm going to continue to discuss, but before I do, I think it's important. I did spend a lot of time last week and the week before talking about climate change and the fact that the nodes and Pluto are square. They were at the last lunation. They'll be at the next lunation. And that square continues until until around the same time, August 5th or 6th or whatever. Is that, we're looking at, because climate change factors into politics, right? And so it's not to be, what I'm trying to say is the discussion that I'm bringing forth is not to be limited just to thinking about politics and political figures, but also to the fact that they have to respond to this climate crisis, which, as Keith Olbermann said yesterday, is now a climate catastrophe, right? So we're reevaluating our own values, as I said before, about what we need to feel emotionally secure. And again, I talked a lot about that last week. Now, I mentioned last week also both Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, the latter of whom yesterday fired 40% of his campaign staff after his disastrous start since his announcement on May 24th that he was running as a GOP nominee for the presidency of the United States of America. And that announcement came as we waxed toward the May 27th first quarter lunar square of the Virgo moon to the Gemini sun under the auspices of the Taurus new moon, which occurred on May 19th. And that first quarter lunar square asked us to push through whether what we were hearing measured up to the actual analytical analysis's conclusions, right? So that was all about values, as I've said numerous times. And Venus retrograde, now we're reevaluating our values, which really, it didn't start in May, but, it got brought into greater consciousness then, at least in my opinion. Now, Trump reportedly can't find any legal representation because so many reputable attorneys believe that he hasn't got a case that he can win. And as I'm recording this, which is late in the day on Thursday, June 27th, he had not yet been indicted. The grand jury had adjourned for the week, so it looks like next Tuesday might be the first time. But meanwhile, I've said before, Trump has a wound to his natal Jupiter. Jupiter rules naturally the ninth house. The ninth house is the archetype of law, and he's wounded based on his relationship with people like Roy Cohn, who was, one of the lawyers for the McCarthy era commission, the anti-communist commission in the 50s. And, if you've never seen the movie The Front by Woody Allen, I highly recommend it. But in any case, Trump has a distorted view of the law and how he can get around it. And now it's come to the point where his chickens are coming home to roost, and he can't find any lawyers who are going to help him. Now it's because they think he doesn't have a case he can win, but there's also a good number of lawyers who know that he stiffs his help, his hired help, whether it's lawyers or anyone else that he buys something from. So there's always that concern too. The lawyers are demanding payment up front, otherwise it's a no-can-do. Now, meanwhile, Ron DeSantis, who, as I said, he's being criticized for ditching half his campaign staff, presumably including, according to CNN, and here I quote, Nate Hochman, who served as a speechwriter for the DeSantis campaign, according to a source familiar with his role, who retweeted a video that features DeSantis's face over the Florida state seal that spins into a sonnenrad with the words, "Make America Florida," as soldiers march in the background. CNN continues, the sonnenrad symbol is an alternative to the swastika and is used to show support for white supremacy and neo-Nazism. And they continue, Nate Hochman is no longer with the campaign, and we will not be commenting on him further, a campaign or DeSantis campaign official told CNN. The campaign declined to comment on whether the video played a role in Hochman's employment status, end quote, or unemployment status. So they no longer value him. I mean, wow, they no longer value someone who puts Nazi symbols into a campaign ad. Gee, what has the world come to? I'd mentioned last week, too, that the lack of DeSantis's time of birth leaves us with a chart that was drawn up for his birthday of September 14th, 1978 in Jacksonville, Florida, but without a time, which means that I normally run a chart for noon. And that will put the moon, which is the fastest moving planet, which I've explained before, at the exact midpoint within that 24-hour period. Now, not to bore you, and I said this last week too, but this means that the potential range of his actual possible moon degree spans from about 15 degrees and 12 minutes to about 29 degrees 53 minutes of Aquarius. He has an Aquarius moon. We don't know the house because we don't have the time, therefore we can't get an ascendant and we can't get the angles set. But given this knowledge, the likelihood that he has or will experience Venus retrograde opposite his natal moon between now and October 7th, when Venus direct again reaches 28 degrees and 36 minutes of Leo, which is the degree at which she originally stationed retrograde, is, about 100%. So I'm guessing, and I think I read to you Rob Hand's delineation of Venus opposite the moon. The moon in mundane astrology is the people. If you're a politician, you need to win over the people, but it's also a feminine archetype. So I'm guessing that a lot of people with this opposition, especially women, don't like his views on policies against wokeism, which isn't really a thing at all. His education denial tactics, forcing schools to deny that slavery might actually have, benefited black people. No, I'm sorry. I think I said that wrong. I had a double negative in here. Let me just see from grammatically. I mean, he's forced the schools in Florida, or is trying to force the schools in Florida, to say that slavery actually benefited black people. And that's because it gave them skills that made them useful. And then some idiot on Fox News, that guy Gutfeld, or whatever his name is, picked up on that theme and decided to talk about how Viktor Frankl, in his book, The Survivor of the Holocaust, I mean, he's gone now, but in his book he wrote about how survival in the Nazi death camps depended on making yourself useful, which was a complete misinterpretation of Frankl's meaning. Okay? So my point here is saying that I think especially women are not digging, DeSantis's viewpoints here, in addition to those things that I mentioned, but in addition to his anti-transgender bias. Remember, mothers bear children. Children may declare themselves to be gay, bisexual, transgender, want to switch gender, whatever, and that mothers may, I hope, decide to love their children no matter what. And so he's pissing a lot of mothers off. And we now have not a lot, but no members of Congress who have transgender children and or gay children, LGBTQ plus, whatever to me it doesn't matter. Whatever you are, we love you, whatever. Your mother loves you, your father should love you, and that's just the way it is. And that's never mind all this Nazi crap. So the other interesting thing that happened this week, which occurred the day after the first quarter lunar square, monthly lunar square, since that Leo new moon, is that it was the first quarter lunar square, which was the Scorpio moon squaring the Leo sun. And that happened on June 25th. I wrote 26th here, but I think it's the 25th. Oh, yeah, the moon squared the sun on the 25th, but on the 26th, and as Mercury and the sun waxed toward their conjunction at 28 Leo on June, I'm sorry, that's a typo. It's Mercury and Venus, retrograde, waxed toward their conjunction at 28 Leo on June 27th. House GOP Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, spaced out during his remarks to the press. Now, McConnell, who was born February 20th of 1942 in Sheffield, Alabama. Well, hang on, because I wrote AF, which doesn't. Alabama. I wrote AF instead of AL. I'm like, what state is AF? It's one of those days, people. Anyway, McConnell, born February 20th, 1942 in Sheffield, Alabama, but with no known birth time. So again, no ascendant, no houses, whatever. Can't pin down. You can pin down all of the planets except the moon. And some of the planets might vary slightly by minute, usually not enough to change a sign. That's really iffy and in a small percentage of cases. So the chart's aspects usually stand for that 24-hour period, except for the moon. So, but he had the Mercury-Venus retrograde conjunction square to his natal 28 minute and 6 degree Taurus Hygeia. Now, Hygeia is the goddess asteroid of health. And both Mercury and Venus at that time had already exact squared his natal 26 degree, 28 minute Uranus in Taurus. This man is coming up for his Uranus return, which for some reason, and I'm not quite sure why, it will occur in about 2 years, I think it is. But, or he's 81 now, but it'll occur at 82. Normally the Uranus return is 84, so it might have to do with his age. I have to check that out. And you know what? Let me get back to you. Anyway, so of course, as I said, Hygeia represents health, and Uranus is a trauma signature. and can imply neurological conduction, the electrical conduction of the nerve endings in the body. And Venus and Mercury are in Leo, which is the heart. And Venus in general represents the physical nature of life, like our bodies. So some kind of neurological, Uranus, health issue, Hygeia, possibly related to his heart, Leo, might be what caused McConnell to blank out for a minute or so. And we'll wait to see if there's anything more lasting to it, or if it's simply something he'll need to keep track of for the future. Now, I suppose I don't need to, but I feel somewhat compelled to add that I don't wish him ill, but I do wish him out of the Senate. So, given my comments last week about Venus retrograde's pending inferior function, which I mentioned again, which is when Venus retrograde conjoins with the Leo Sun on August 13th, and the ensuing heliacal rising 6 or 7 days later that both Aaron Sullivan and Bruce Schofield speak about or have spoken about, and its connotation with, quote, a time of failure or resignation on the part of leaders, according to astrologer Bruce Schofield, we may be looking at someone like McConnell, having done all the damage that he can possibly do, now running out of steam. And that may prove to be especially true since his progressed sun, again, we don't know what house, but his progressed sun is in Taurus now, and conjunct to his natal Mars and Saturn. He has a natal Mars-Saturn conjunction. Now, Mars-Saturn is extreme frustration. So, if a progressed sun is conjoining Mars, it wants to go, go, go. But it also can, be in danger. It can be something like moving too fast and tripping, which is what gave him a concussion and some broken ribs, right, previously. And the sun conjunct Saturn is slow down, you're moving too fast. So there's a bit of a push-pull going on here, I mean, for example, and I'm just riffing here. I'm not predicting, okay? His doctors tell him, oh, you got to take it easy. You're not fully recovered. Oh, you had a TIA. Oh, you got to be careful. And he may be like, no, I'm not going anywhere, until Mars, kind of pushes them out the door. But we'll see. And likewise for DeSantis, but it's a bit harder to tell from his chart because we have a little bit less information here that I feel confident about, going into. I think DeSantis, by all reports, is on the way down. Whether they're accurate or not, who knows? People who've been suggested as winners early in the contest before the primaries even happen have taken those falls from grace, and vice versa. Biden's a good example. He did terrible in the first primary in 2020, but he rebounded, right? So who knows? Anyway, let's talk on a more personal level for a few, which is that while Venus is retrograde, the stereotypical interpretation is that old flames may reemerge. And I think I said this last week too, especially between now and September 3rd, to test whether short-term pleasures supersede long-term values in a relationship and whether we should recommit anew or move on. So it's best, like Aaron Sullivan says, and I also discussed last week, to think back 8 years and try to remember where you were in terms of your relationships then, which may give you a hint or a guide to follow now about Venus retrograde's greater meaning. My story is not so happy. I lost my mother 3 days after Venus stationed retrograde in Leo in my 12th house. Close to and near as it did this time, was 2 degrees different. My natal late Pluto in Leo, and that was in late July of 2015. I lost her on July 28th, and I think Venus stationed retrograde 3 days before. I think it was the 25th. But I also had transiting Uranus in Aries in my 8th house of death. squaring my 11th house Cancer moon. My mother did die fairly suddenly after being admitted to the hospital with some inability to eat, and they discovered she had a tear, a rip, a leak, whatever, in her colon, and she basically died about, they operated her, she went into the hospital on a Thursday night, they operated her on a Friday afternoon, and she was gone by Tuesday night. So please don't use my example as your guide. Use your own history, and I do hope it is a little bit happier. Now, the next time in 18 months that Venus retrogrades, you'll go back 8 years from then, and so on and so forth. So clearly not all of my Venus retrogrades have been that unhappy, but this one is just not a terrific one. So I wish you a lot more of a happy historical past with this particular Venus retrograde. But meanwhile, along with Venus's call to review our relationship status now, we have the fact that wounded healer Chiron station retrograde at 19 degrees and 58 minutes of Aries on July 23rd calls us also to muster the courage to speak out about old wounds in order to heal them going forward, which is something I said before. But this tells us that should old lovers contact us now, this might prove the opportunity to grow in consciousness about exactly how and why any residual wounds we still carry with us might be healed now. And that's ditto for existing relationships to which we may ultimately decide to recommit in the end. So in other words, Venus retrograde doesn't always mean that you're destined for the breakup, but the point is that both Venus and Chiron's retrogrades overlapping now allow us all, both personally and collectively, to think about what we need and value most in partnership going forward, and to make sure that there is a quid pro quo. Now, however, since Chiron's retrograde lasts longer than Venus's, it lasts until December 26th of this year, when the wounded healer stations direct again at 15 degrees 27 minutes of Aries, we might review by asking ourselves the following. What's prevented us, or me, from dealing courageously with old partnership wounds? How can we move toward Aries North Node courage now, which happens to be, Aries is ruled by Mars, but Aries and Mars rule the sign through which Chiron's currently transiting now and retrograding now. So how can we move towards Aries North Node courage if we don't speak out against injustices that have rendered some of us unequal to others in the eyes of society at large? This is defending and protecting Aries. I didn't say anything when they came from my friend, and I didn't say anything when they came from my neighbor, and I didn't say anything when they came from my boss, and I didn't say anything when they came from my wife, and oh, look, now they're coming for me. And thirdly, how good might it feel to be relieved of the burden of carrying past wounding on ad nauseum into the future? That's a karmic question, right? If we work on healing some of this stuff now, then we don't have to come back and do it all again. Now, to get back to the microcosm, we might have felt a bit woo-woo or confused, and like we needed to adjust our thinking when Mercury quincunxed Neptune late July 26 or early July 27, but we can use that July 27th Mercury-Venus conjunctions energies to now better understand the patterns behind our perceptions of our existing relationships now. I'm going to say that again. This is a good conjunction, especially because Venus is retrograde, to better understand the patterns, what causes us, what kind of behavioral patterns cause us to have certain kinds of perceptions about our existing relationships now. Our perceptions may not always reflect reality. That's the point here. And today's Mercury-Pluto quincunx which happens late July 27 and early July 28th, calls us to use the recognition of our past behavioral patterns to rethink adjusting them now, along with adjusting the balance of power within our partnerships. Now, be wary of becoming too critical, though, when Mercury enters nitpicky but health and service-oriented Virgo today on July 28th. We may become more focused on the details, which can be both positive and negative, depending. Uber criticism of partners, sans compassion, can make us seem cold or cruel, while lovingly detailed analysis, explanations, and advice may prove we get more flies with honey than vinegar in the long run. Now, Mercury remains in Virgo, and I think I mentioned this last week too, until October 4th, due to its retrograde in earthy Virgo between August 23rd and September 15th, which will allow us to review and reanalyze detailed data we might then apply to the energies of the September 14th Virgo new moon. But we'll get into more on that anon. Now, Mercury's retrograde in earth signs asks us to review the quality of our lives. And that has to do with our resources and how we value those resources. So in Virgo, of course, we're going to be asked to evaluate, reevaluate, review, rethink, reanalyze, redo, replan, all that stuff, where we are in terms of our own physical health, what we do on a daily basis as part of our routine, which is often considered, because Virgo's sixth house, Virgo ruled sixth house is considered a work house, and how we either are or want to be of service. Now, for those of us like me who are getting elderly, we might think more in terms of our health. For younger people, it might be more about reevaluating or evaluating for the first time how they really want to spend their day, the hours in their day. Do I want to go back commuting to an office? Do I want to stay home and work? And that is a hard line. And if my employer isn't going to allow me to do that in the future, well, then I'll just get another job, and or reevaluate what you do on a daily basis as it serves the greater humanity in general. So in other words, elderly people may be looking at being of greater service to themselves, and younger people may be looking more at careers or occupations or hobbies or vocations that give them a greater sense of being valuable and of service to a greater cause. Now, the Leo Sun's quincunx to Saturn in Pisces later tonight and early tomorrow on July 28th and 29th tells us that an adjustment may be necessary to how much courage we have to face making changes to our ego's belief system. Standing up to authority can give us a greater sense of identity now, while simultaneously unblocking obstacles to our freedom of expression. Remember, Leo, the sun in Leo is greatly creative. It's part of, I was originally intending to go into it, but I pretty much went into it last week. Things like creatives going out on strike, the writers in LA and Hollywood who are saying, there are a lot of us who don't make any money compared to what the CEOs and the owners of these big entertainment companies are raking in. So hello, could you share part of the pie? These are things that are affecting the economy. The UPS strike, which coincidentally seems like it's on the verge of getting solved, would have put about 350,000 people on strike, which would have, according to some estimates, affected the bottom line of the economy. Venus retrograde in Leo. Venus is value. Value is one of the things we all value, for better or for worse, is money. Would have put the economy in the hole to the tune of $3 billion. I had more statistics on that, but I'm not going to belabor that right now. So in any case, as I said, the quincunx of the sun in Leo to Saturn in Pisces is always, Saturn's always about authority figures, and the sun is about our own individual creativity and our uniqueness and our solar selves standing up to be authentic, right? So we, as I said, we want to have a greater sense of authority, a greater sense of our own identity now, and to say, well, you can't tell me, you can't block my freedom of expression. And doing so can help us adjust any idealistic romantic notions by bringing them further down to earth through realizing we have an obligation to both ourselves and to the collective to be more realistic in our dreams now, as Venus retrograde quincunxes Neptune in Pisces July 29. And that's going to lead us into August 1st, Aquarius new moon, which occurs at 9 degrees and 16 minutes of the opposite the Leo sun at the same degree at 11:32 a.m. Pacific and 2:32 p.m. Eastern Time, again on August 1st. It's then we'll be asked to release our attachment to personal glory. So it's kind of weird because the sun's quincunx to Saturn is like stand up and be who you are, but yet it's going to be almost immediately followed by the Aquarius moon, which says, hey, sit down, you're part of the greater group, you know, stop hogging the spotlight and all, trying to get all the attention. It's not all about you, you know, it's about the greater good and, you know, progress for humanity. So it's at this Aquarius full moon, we'll be asked, like I said, to release our attachment to feeling personally like special, because that's what slows down the future progress of equality for all. In short, the Aquarius moon opposes the Leo sun, asking us to let go of the need to be special by remembering we're all members of a bigger group, the human race. So Pluto retrograde in Capricorn still squares the Libra South node and the Aries North node at this lunation. As I mentioned before, it will do so until at least the end of the first week of August, and it still heralds that future of evolutionary change as we're still in the U.S. Pluto return period. So we may feel, despite everything I just said, a little bit bipolar at this August 1st lunation, because on that day as well, just after the lunation exacts, Mars trines Jupiter, and that can make us feel lucky. Mars trine Jupiter is something my son has in his chart, and I'll tell you, man, you know, he has gotten out of scrapes with authority as a young person more times than I can count on one hand, to such an astounding degree that, you know, I talk about him a little bit, but not often. He would probably kill me if he ever listened to this, but he had a Scorpio moon and an 8th house Aries sun. You know, he liked to defy authority a lot, but somehow or other, they always pretty much let him off the hook. Anyway, so the Mars-Jupiter trine can make us feel optimistic, lucky, the sky's the limit, that kind of thing. But Mercury in Virgo opposite Saturn retrograde in Pisces inclines us more towards feeling lonely and depressed and having those kind of nobody loves me thoughts. So again, partnerships become increasingly intense as we, you know, go through this lunation, or as we go through our relationship review at this lunation. And that's going to be especially true for any of us with Pluto in late Leo, because that's where Venus stationed retrograde, where Mercury combined, you know, there. And because the Venus retrograde also, as she moves back from 28 to 12 degrees of Leo, is going to conjoin people with Pluto in Leo in those degrees. So also oppose those with planets in Aquarius. And planets in Aquarius, like the aforementioned Ron DeSantis' moon, or square to those with planets in those degrees, particularly Pluto in Scorpio. So, you know, the Pluto and Scorpio generation, I'm looking at you. Or who have planets in Taurus between those degrees. So clearly those with the latter degrees will start off with more intensity, and then, you know, as Venus moves back, it will shift slightly. But if you got a Pluto or a Pluto in Scorpio, a Pluto in Leo, Whatever, call me. This lunation, Aquarius full moon, is also experiencing a waxing trine of the Aquarius moon to Ceres in Libra, which is all about sharing that which nurtures us equally, at least in my opinion. And the Leo sun sextile to Ceres in Libra, which can give us the opportunity to recognize the divinity in us all. And it's sort of like, in a weird way, that sextile with the sun, while the moon is opposing it, right, is sort of like saying, okay, you know that you're divinely inspired, so that means you don't always have to be center stage. Like, having the confidence to know you're special doesn't mean you have to prove it all the time, right? But also there may be, that may prove to be, or give us a leg up a little bit as part of the power struggle that's going to be growing now as Juno in Cancer waxes toward an exact opposition to Pluto retrograde, which will perfect on August 13th. So we may well vacillate between over-optimism about the future, as I said, and also short-term worries about, being abandoned and lonely, that the future won't look good as we're reevaluating our current relationships or partnerships. And of course, when I say relationship, as I've said many times before, it's not only significant other, it's family members, it's children, it's colleagues, it's friends, it's bosses, anybody and everybody that you want to put into that category. But this becoming overly optimistic about the future is going to wax more because the exact square between the Leo Sun and Jupiter and Taurus occurs on August 6th. And a freedom closeness dilemma, which is how I define this, the aspect will arise when Venus retrograde squares expect the unexpected Uranus on August 9th. So I call this square the freedom closeness dilemma, which is something that Rob Hand in his book Planets in Transit describes as the need for excitement, and here I quote, and stimulation through your love relationships, even to the point of provoking a fight. The existing patterns of relationships will become difficult to deal with if you know that they are basically constructive. Be careful of being impatient with loved ones, demanding that they gratify your need for excitement, unless, of course, you want to have an argument. On the other hand, this is a good day for getting things out into the open where the two of you may reach an understanding. If you and your loved one are under constraints, then you can enjoy many new experiences with each other. And I think he means under constraints. I think he means being confident about your commitment. In fact, this transit can be a test of the flexibility of your relationship. The less flexible it is, the more disruptive this transit will be. He continues, and I quote, there is a tendency to flirt under this influence, which need not be harmful if you don't take it seriously. Do not make anything more out of an encounter than it really signifies. And Hand further warns to be careful of making impulsive purchases at this time, as a sudden desire for something Venusian may overtake you in the moment, but it could be something you think is beautiful now, but in a couple of weeks you'll be like, oh, I don't really like that, Oh, and it was non-refundable. Okay. Meanwhile, however, Mercury in Virgo's trine to Jupiter that I mentioned at the Aquarius full moon sharpens our thinking and allows us to see all potential future solutions. So again, I mentioned this, that Juno, the goddess asteroid of partnership, opposes Pluto retrograde and squares the transiting nodes on August 13th, which is the same day the Leo Sun and Venus retrograde conjoin or meet at their inferior function, which heralds that period between then and August 19th and 20th, when diplomatic relations may be strained and partnerships become less secure, as previously mentioned. So this aspect represents actually the second time, going back to Venus square Uranus, that it will occur. The first having happened when Venus was direct on July 2nd. So you might want to hark back to anything that might have happened in your life or your relationships around that time. This may give you a clue about what you might be revisiting soon. An impulsive purchase maybe, an impulsive love affair, an impulsive breakup. Only you know for sure, right? So again, Venus will, it squared Uranus on July 2nd. It's going to re-square Uranus. What did I just say? I just want to make sure that I'm clear about this because, hold on. I look in my handy dandy Llewellyn calendar for the, Pluto squared Uranus on the 23rd. And Venus re-squares Uranus retrograde on August 9th. Okay. And then there will be a third one to complete the trifecta. Give me a second. Yeah, Venus will square Uranus when she's direct again for the third time on September 29th, which happens to be the same day as the Aries full moon, when the Aries moon opposes the Libra sun, reminding us not to compromise too much for the sake of partnership, and that independence is an important skill to develop. You see, you feel this theme here? Juno will join Venus and Leo that day, and both will be waxing toward trines to the Aries North Node and sextiles to the Libra South Node, aiding us in this movement from past codependence to future independence. And ditto for that pair's sextile to Mars and Libra, then, providing us opportunities for harmonious freedom within partnership. Although that may take some adjustment in thinking, since that Juno-Venus pair will also wax into a quincunx with Neptune, telling us to let go of those fantasies that block our opportunities for real love. So that should prove an interesting time, huh? Anyway, that's pretty much it for today. I was hoping to talk a little bit more. I wanted to talk, and maybe next week I will, about Israel, the situation in Israel. I didn't talk too much about politics today outside from those specific people I mentioned. But I want to say one thing, that the upheaval in Israel right now is part and parcel of the fact that what's interesting is that Israel took an eclipse. It took the, not the April one, but the May 5th eclipse from this year occurred at 1458 Scorpio, and Israel has a 1341 South Node in its first house in Scorpio. So a lot of what's going on, and that the nodes in Israel's chart, which is dated May 14th, 1948 at 4 p.m. in Tel Aviv, Israel, the South and North Node are squared by Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Libra in the 10th house. And in addition to that, Saturn specifically also is square to Chiron at 2124 Scorpio, which conjoins the South Node and opposes the 2339 Taurus Sun in the 8th house. So that's a second house to 8th house opposition, and T squared to the 10th house. And the issue in Israel now, of course, is about judicial power. So I do want to talk at a future date about the equivalencies that are happening with our Supreme Court and with Israel's Supreme Court, as the right wing in Israel seeks to weaken the Supreme Court's influence and power at a time when in the U.S. the Supreme Court's power seems to have been heightened in favor of right wing. So the right wing wants to weaken the Supreme Court in Israel, and the right wing wants to strengthen the Supreme Court, or has in fact already done so in America. So we'll talk about that, but I say keep an eye, for those of you who are internationally oriented, keep an eye on Israel, because there's so much going on with the fact that the Supreme Court is now taking up whether or not the vote that was taken in the Knesset to deprive it of power is something that they can weigh in on or not. And there is a kind of fascinating conundrum involved in that. So we'll get back to that next week, hopefully. Oh, but next week I will probably be on vacation. I am going to attend Stephen Forrest's Omega Institute program, to which I actually do not have to fly. I can get in my car and drive like 90 miles. So I will be joining him up in Rhinebeck, New York. I spoke about his conference or gig or whatever last week and the week before. So I hope if anyone listening has signed up, I will get a chance to meet you there. And, hopefully it'll be a fun time. So I probably will rerun this particular podcast, if not a different one from the past, for next week. So I'll see you in 2 weeks, and that's why I gave some of the more extensive analysis all the way up through August 13th, because you'll have a little bit of a background on that prior to the next podcast. All right, guys, thanks everyone for joining me. I do hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. Please be sure to join me next week, and if not next week, the week after, for another episode of Karmic Evolutions, Astrologically Speaking. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free